So thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Auditory Speech Language Processing, Strengthening the Pathways for Communication with Dr. Kavita Kaul. So much of how we connect and communicate begins with how we listen. When a child struggles with listening or language, we often focus on the words themselves, but the real key lies deeper. It's in how the brain processes sound and emotion together, and that's where today's conversation leads us. And I'm honored to introduce today's guest, Dr. Kavita Kaul, joining us from Richmond, Virginia. Hello, Kavita.
Hi, how are you?
I am fantastic. So happy to have you. So, to give
I'm
some
here.
background to the group on Dr. Kaul, she's both an audiologist and a speech and language pathologist. And this really allows her to bridge how we listen, how we speak, and how we connect. With more than 25 years of experience in clinical practice, teaching, and research, she's dedicated her career to understanding how auditory processing shapes communication across the lifespan. She's earned her master's degree in speech and hearing from the All India Institute of Speech and Hearing and holds a clinical doctorate in audiology from A.T. Still University. Through her practice, Express, Hear, Express, Learn, Process, Dr. Kaul works with children and adults to strengthen what she calls the pathways of communication, helping clients build listening, speech, and language from the inside out. Her research and clinical work have focused on auditory speech and language processing disorders and evidence-based interventions that directly support her clients' needs and treatment goals. As a certified provider of the listening program, she integrates neuroscience and music listening therapy to help clients achieve age-appropriate speech and language skills while supporting emotional regulation and communication. Dr. Kaul will share how strengthening auditory processing and emotional regulation creates the foundation for clear speech, learning, and social connection. Her approach integrates neuroscience, music, and therapy in ways that really bring hope and tangible progress, which is so important to the children and families she serves. Her work, really reminds us that communication begins with how we listen, and that every brain, no matter its challenges or its current strengths, has the capacity to grow, organize, and express itself more fully. Dr. Kaul, it's such a pleasure to have you with us.
Same here. I am looking forward to this conversation.
I am too. And, before we continue, what I want to do is just take a few minutes to introduce the listening program for some context, because it connects directly to everything that we're exploring today about auditory processing, speech, and language. So, briefly, the listening program, or TLP, is a neuroscience based music listening therapy that helps strengthen the brain's ability to process sound. It's been used by more than 1 million people around the world for over 25 years, and it's supported by decades of research in auditory neuroscience and neuroplasticity, including peer-reviewed studies showing measurable gains in auditory processing, sensory regulation, communication, attention, learning, and emotional regulation, and more. What makes TLP different from ordinary music is that every note is intentionally recorded and engineered using neuroacoustic modifications with precise changes in tone and frequency and timing to help the brain organize and interpret sound more efficiently. In speech and communication, we rely on a wide range of frequencies to hear and produce language. The low frequencies help support rhythm, prosody, and the grounding sense of our own voice. Mid-range frequencies carry the clarity and intelligibility of speech sounds, the consonants and vowels that make words distinct, and the higher frequencies add brightness, life, articulation, and the fine details that allow us to understand speech in noisy environments. TLP's music is designed to train the brain across all of these frequencies, improving how we perceive, integrate, and express language. When auditory processing is well organized, communication comes naturally. A child can follow directions, stay engaged, express themselves with confidence. When it's disorganized, speech may sound flat, unclear, it may be delayed. TLP works with a daily exercise for the auditory system, helping the brain tune into the full range of sound frequencies needed for clear, expressive communication. Each listening session is 9 to 15 minutes and begins with a gentle warm up to prepare the auditory pathways, moves into a focused period of stimulation that strengthens listening and speech processing, and completes with a cool down that restores calm and balance. Sessions are brief, but consistency over time really creates lasting change. Listeners often notice improvements in clarity of speech, ease of listening, emotional regulation, and connection. For children developing communication skills, for adults rebuilding auditory focus, or anyone looking to have a stronger mind-body balance, TLP offers a structured, research-based way for the brain to better listen, feel, and respond with greater harmony. So while it's built around music, it's truly a comprehensive auditory training experience, one that complements Dr. Kaul's insights beautifully about how listening and emotional regulations form the foundation for speech, learning, and connection. So, Dr. Kaul, you've dedicated years to helping families improve listening, speech, and language. And I'm curious, when did you first recognize the very deep connection between auditory processing, emotional regulation, and communication?
So the reason I got into more and more into auditory processing was because when I was working in the school system, there was very little available to help these kids in the schools other than going to the teachers to have them provide them accommodation and modification. And I just didn't feel that was enough. So my mentor, Jack Katz, who just passed recently, he was the one who kind of put me on this track of understanding what auditory processing was. And I always remember his words. He said that one of his very significant patient who was almost going to commit suicide because of very significant auditory processing was the one who he kind of helped build that confidence and understanding and kind of reverse that process. And he also always said that there's probably a lot of people in the juvenile system who are possibly on this who have this significant difficulty in auditory processing. And if you just work on the auditory skills, not just, if you start working on the auditory skills, a lot of other things kind of fall into place. And that got me thinking. And I, with his mentorship and his support, that got me thinking. And I started looking for more avenues to see how the whole thing kind of relates to each other. And then eventually, right now, at the point where I am, I feel like there is no one thing in the brain that has, which takes all of that function of communication. It's the whole brain that has to work together. And for that whole brain to work together, the emotional system is a big part of it because they all kind of play off of each other. The auditory system and the emotional system are so closely housed in the brain that there's a lot of co-regulation going on, and weak auditory skills makes the emotional system overactive, and then as that becomes more overactive, it then again affects the auditory system. So that's how the whole evolution of how I got into this emotional regulation. And of course, one of your very significant contributors, Dr. Lucker also, who's in our group here, has also kind of shaped how I think about this emotional system and auditory pathways and auditory processing. And then, of course, there's no auditory processing by itself. There's auditory that affects speech, which affects language. So it's all the whole brain. It's the same brain that we talk, walk, sneeze, do everything. So we've got to get that integration very strong.
First of all, what a loss with Dr. Katz. And for those that aren't familiar with Jack Katz, he's really the father of our understanding of auditory processing. So to have Jack as your mentor, how incredible for you. And then
Oh, I feel very blessed about that. I don't think I can ever thank God enough for giving me that opportunity.
and then to follow that on, with Dr. Lucker, who I've had the pleasure of, working with for over 2 decades in the research arena in this field, who brings such a thought-provoking understanding and deep experience, especially with the relationship of emotional regulation to auditory processing. So very, very strong background for you to build a career upon. And I'm really interested, Kavita. Can you think of a moment with a client, a particular experience that made you really realize how inseparable these systems are?
Yeah, I was looking at those questions yesterday and I was trying to scratch my brain to see if I can think of one person, every child I work with, if that auditory system is being stimulated correctly and they're making progress, which I see majority of the time. Now, there's always exceptions to the rule. I'm not saying um, this is a magic potion. You have to put the work in. But every child, when we do what's called the Buffalo Model Questionnaire, BMQ, their changes that we see, apart from the pre and post therapy results, the changes we see in functional growth and the feedback I get from parents and like, oh, they're really socially engaged. They're not irritable anymore. They're not, in their own world anymore. They're coming back and at the dinner table and having conversation. I hear that so often. I just couldn't pick up one patient to say this is what happened. It's not standing out, but all of them have such significant improvement from what we do on a daily basis. And as Jack says, I'm going to be quoting Jack a lot, I'm sure, but he says therapy doesn't have to be this complex thing. It has to be simple and effective approach. So the simple, effective approach that we use, which is a whole brain approach with, Jack Katz's therapy process and all the other ancillary support systems like TLP program and other things that we use, just helps that brain feel so much at ease. We're basically, by allowing the sensory systems to uh, kind of settle in the brain the way it should. We're real fostering that homeostasis, which is what we want the brain to be, that neutral zone. We don't want the brain to be overexcited all the time or completely dull all the time. Both sides is not helpful or conducive for that social engagement. And that's what I think we're doing by helping the brain understand these are sensory inputs that are not danger signals to your brain. So let it come in, and then you can filter what you want and what you don't want, and then that'll help you really be more in the moment during the conversation.
Well, I'm glad you said that because the idea is we are designed to have an adaptive, flexible system that can respond moment to moment to what's coming into our environment. And
Correct.
what we often see in individuals with auditory processing challenges is that the flexibility isn't there for a number of reasons. And I think maybe to lay a good foundation, Dr. Call, it would be helpful if you could just walk us through kind of auditory processing 101. What is it and why does it matter so much for our speech and language?
Again, quoting my favorite person, Jack Katz, it is auditory processing, what the brain does it with what the ear hears. So if the ear is hearing what we do, the pure tone test that we do, and we say, oh, they're hearing all these frequencies from 250 hertz to 8,000 hertz, they're hearing all the frequency at 0 decibels, so their hearing is fine, which is correct to a certain degree, but that's just the peripheral system we're looking at. What really happens for social engagement to be able to understand and be coherent in the way that you take that sensory information and then respond coherently and respond appropriately is how the physics of sound that goes through your ears, how does that physics of sound actually get transmitted from the ear to the brain. And that whole pathway from the ear to the brain is a neural connection. It's like turning on the switch and the light coming on. If that connection is not very precise, if it is not connected without any kinks in the wire, if that's not there, then you're not going to light up that area of the brain in the auditory system. Now, what is speech and language? It is a speech motor output to the sensory input that's called sound. The sound is a sensory input. It's one of the five senses, actually six, if you include proprioception, and seven if you include interoception, your hunger and all of that. But if that information that goes in does not have precise and exact representation in the brain, which is in your auditory area, then what the little engravings that you're making in your brain is, if it's erroneous, you're going to hear p as b, t, d as g. And if you're trying to do that, especially with ear infections, if you're trying to figure out what the word is as a little child when they start learning language, if you cannot have a consistent bat for bat every time you see a bat, or you see a bird, an animal that is a bat, you're not going to be able to develop those vocabulary skills because it's a moving target always. So as Jack says, that auditory system, auditory area of the brain is the only place where these phonemes, the speech sounds, are engraved. And unless these speech sounds are engraved sound for sound, very precisely and concisely, where efficiency and the accuracy is important, your language output is going to be very either delayed, or it's going to be deficient, or I see pragmatic language issues where social communication becomes hard, so they become withdrawn. You see a whole gamut of responses from it, which looks like either ADHD or autism or anything under the sun sometimes. And sometimes they're very good communicators, but they can't read. So that auditory system is such an integral part of that whole communication circle. That's why I say we need to work on this auditory processing, speech processing, and language processing. Otherwise, we're not stimulating the brain from all sides.
And what what you're saying, just to restate for those that this is a new idea, you can have perfect hearing and significant auditory processing issues. And I think that people can fail to realize just how complex auditory processing truly is. There is a classical auditory pathway, there is a non-classical auditory pathway. We're starting with the hearing organ, but we're going from the brain stem, we're going all the way up to the cortex and then back. And things are happening with very precise timing. So we can have one kink in the chain that throws off the rest of the chain. So, there are some complexities to this, but the beauty is it doesn't have to be complex to improve auditory processing challenges. So I'd love to get in a little bit about how we strengthen those pathways and what your experience is and your approach when there are auditory processing challenges. What are you doing?
Um, I have a questionnaire. I look at all of the different systems. I see if there is difficulties in the visual system, as a difficulty in the balance system, or the auditory system, or the emotional system. So look at all of that, and based on that, I make my recommendations. But always I start with Dr. Katz's therapy process, where, like he calls it, simple and effective, where we start with speech sounds. As we know that the brain from almost zero month of when the child is born all the way up to 3 years or so, they're just learning to hear and listen. Their real communication, even though they start communicating around 1.5 years, the real communication in terms of full sentences and coherence and all of that comes past that. So that's a critical phase where they're really listening to the speech sounds. The brain's open to all kinds of sounds. But as you know, if you're born in an English-speaking country, you start to develop the English sounds. If you're born in a French-speaking country, you start developing the sounds for that language. So that period, you are actually making those engravings for each of those phonemes of that language. And then you start pruning out all of the other areas which you don't need. So what I do with how I approach it is, if there's an emotional component, I will I always suggest that they do music perception therapy. That's what I call it, TLP. I don't call it music therapy because that's a whole new different area. So I call it music perception therapy. I do other things like rhythm training, such as interactive metronome. And then the actual one-on-one therapy is where we start helping the brain understand speech sounds. All the 44 phonemes of English language, we go through it methodically, 3 sounds at each session, 4 sounds at each session. We teach the brain how to listen to those sounds, how to discriminate them, how to recognize them, how to put them together to blend into words, how to analyze those sounds, and then how to listen to these. Once they know those, the decoding is strong, then we start working on speech and noise, have background noise, and see if they can understand those words in noise. And then then we do speech and noise, listening to words and noise, and then we do what's called an integration. For strong auditory processing, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere have to integrate and coordinate with each other. So we do what's called dichotic listening therapies, where they have to hear words coming from both ears at the same time. And that's one of the, apart from the decoding therapy that we do, that's very unique to our therapy approach. The dichotic listening skills is another very unique therapy that audiologists are familiar with, that you don't see it in other therapy programs. And of course, in the background at home, they're doing the listening program or other things that I do recommend, which kind of all beautifully works together to help the whole brain integrate without feeling overwhelmed.
Yeah, I greatly appreciate that you really are looking holistically, at the whole child, so often, and I've witnessed this, having now been in this field over 30 years, this progression to more of a whole child approach, which is so refreshing, so that we're not just staying maybe in our lane of, I am a speech language therapist and audiologist, so I'm going to focus on the hearing communication system. You're looking at how these different systems, interact. So, when a child's struggling with speech, we often focus on articulation or oral motor skills. But what you're saying is that emotional regulation and auditory processing are equally essential. So maybe could you go a little bit deeper on how these systems interact with each other?
So as you had touched upon the classical and non-classical pathways, what we know is that when you're born, yeah, your hearing might be perfect, but those hearing skills initially are used for non-classical survival skills. It's like you hear a loud noise, you startle, you cry, you get attention, you want comfort. Those are the only reasons that your auditory system is being utilized for through the non-classical. They're not yet at a stage of actual um, uh, engaging socially for meaningful communication, which over time, as the auditory system becomes more and more mature and they are exposed to all the sounds in the environment, and then the brain learns how to filter sounds that are not relevant versus what's relevant as they grow along from 0 months all the way to 3, and then over to 5, and then again till 12, that's how long the whole auditory system takes to mature. It's really making those classical pathways, which goes from the brainstem directly to the auditory area. But the non-classical pathways is an emotional system. It goes from the brainstem to the limbic system, and the limbic system is where the emotional part of the brain is housed. According to Jack Katz, again, I'm quoting him, the limbic system and the hippocampus, which is the memory system, and the auditory area of the brain, which is right here in the temporal region, right over your left brain, left ear, it's in the left side. That's where most of the actual auditory processing is happening. And those systems are very correlated and they're right next to each other. So when the classical auditory pathways are not developing or have not been stimulated or haven't made the correct maturity processes, built on the maturity process in the nature's timeline, the non-classical pathways become more and more active. And then pretty much, to me, the way I visualize is it takes over the brain. And when the emotional system is so high and takes over the brain, it disconnects from the higher level thinking, which is the cognitive linguistic system, the higher level processes, the neocortex, as we call it, becomes disengaged, and you go into the fight or flight mode. That disengagement does not, at the consequence of that is your executive functioning, which is your director in the brain to say, okay, now you act, or now you act, or now you both have to act together. That director, the conductor of the brain, is not learning to develop again in nature's timeline. There's no such thing as at 25 that executive function just switches on and says, okay, now I'm ready to it is a developmental process right from the time you're a baby. The very fact that once the baby touches something hot and the next time they don't do that, is an executive function to say, wait, you've had experience. But if you do not develop on those executive skills right from the time you are developing language and developing those cognitive skills, that again becomes less active. So you are always, not only are you emotionally charged and dysregulated, you are now looking for an external executor to help you organize your environment, to help you say what to do next, or go put on your shoe, now go and wash your hands, or now go sit at the table. You want an external conductor, which is your mom or dad or somebody, to be telling you every time what to do. So it's a domino effect of how one process can just kind of, the whole brain function falls apart. Like Nina Kraus, one of the neuroscientists, also, I remember her saying, it's truly the hearing brain. It's not the hearing system, it's the hearing brain. It just has its tentacles connected to everything in the brain, including your balance system.
What you're really, speaking to is the importance of environment, the importance of good quality sensory experiences, the avoidance when possible of things that may be adverse to impacting our development. And this is, true of the whole brain and all aspects of our human development. And it is this domino effect, this brick by brick, we are building the future of how we interpret and respond to our environment, and most importantly, to others, right? Parents, teachers, neighbors, community. And wouldn't it be lovely if everyone had fantastic auditory processing and empathy in today's world where there's so much miscommunication happening today? So many people are misunderstanding each other's views and intentions, and it leads to such strife in so many ways. And I'm speaking at that kind of macro level of what's happening on this planet today, but bringing it back down to the families and the practitioners that are with us. Early development really matters, and I wonder, Kavita, if you have a few signs that the parents of younger children with us today should be looking for in early development to understand that things are going well, or maybe there may be a cause for some concern and a reason to seek some therapeutic supports?
Yeah. Um, uh, I cannot tell you the importance of um, keeping your senses open when the child has ear infections. It is such a huge red flag for auditory processing because that fluid in the ear, sometimes you don't even have an infection where you need um, antibiotics or medical um treatment for that, but that fluid sitting, they actually, Katz again has done a study where he has taken chinchillas and put fluid in the ear, which resembles the fluid in the ear of humans for when they have otitis media. And the way the brain was processing the sound is so significantly different in terms of the spectral output. It just shows that fluid sitting is not allowing the sounds to go through the brain like it should. So of course, the representation of those sounds in the brain is going to be completely distorted. And when you have distorted representations, you know your communication is going to be affected. If you feel like they're delayed in learning to speak, or they are kind of not responding to you when they're not looking at you face to face, or they don't respond to your name, to their names when you call them from another room. Those are some of the red flags to kind of look out for and say something is wrong. Now, ENT physicians, for whatever reason over the years, has discouraged physicians to use tubes when they have ear infections, and they wait and they give antibiotics for a long time before they can even consider it. But if you're seeing all these signs that their communication is not developing on time, you may want to kind of be the advocate and start asking for for tubes to be put in, which will, once you free up that fluid in the ear, it helps with the processing. Now, again, there are studies that show that because we are dealing with neuroplasticity in the brain, which means if you stimulate the brain correctly, you make the right pathways. But if you stimulate the brain wrong, you will have maladaptive neural pathways that will develop. So if there is fluid sitting for a long time, you've already made those maladaptive pathways. And even if you release the fluid with tubes, it doesn't mean that those pathways that have been formed will become accurate automatically. You may still need some therapy for that. So that's also there. If the speech is not intelligible as they're growing up, and you're the only one who can understand them, and the strangers and outsiders just don't understand, that's another red flag. If they're starting to look like they're having some autism kind of characteristics. Now, I'm not saying all autism is an auditory processing issue, but there is an auditory processing component to all autistic kids. So you may want to look into that. So there are so many different red flags. Jaundice at birth, um, not every kid, but that's a red flag also when you have jaundice at birth and and they've been in treatment for a while or didn't get a treatment. COVID is another thing that's the latest that's causing some auditory issues. So those are some of the things to look out for young parents, especially ear infection. That's the main
Yeah.
culprit that I see over and over again.
Yeah, and that's we could spend an episode solely on ear infections and causes and remediation and impacts. So I'm so glad that you brought that up, because that's one of the biggies that people just, if they don't know, they can take for granted just how serious they actually are.
Right.
Wow, such a rich conversation today, Kavita. I wish we had double the time, because I'm loving where this is going. I know that you're incorporating the listening program into your work and have for some time. Could you share how this has supported your clients and where it's most crucial in your practice?
Can you clarify that? What is supporting?
Well, when, we've discussed a number of issues with auditory processing, speech and language, emotional regulation. When is it that you decide the listening program is going to be part of the intervention that you're recommending for a family? And how do you see this best supporting improvement in these deficit areas that we've been discussing today?
Most of the time, I have my own method of taking the intake information, and I see some dysregulation, executive skills dysfunction. They're always kind of irritable, or they're not socially wanting to engage as much, withdrawn. So those are the things that I see in my intake. I say, this is what I recommend. Um, Really, I have to leave it to the parents to see if they want to do that or not, because there's always a back end of it as a cost issue. So I will recommend that to all of them where I see an emotional dysregulation there. Um, if it is a child with very low skills, where they may not be able to even get started with the simple and effective program that I use, the first go-to is, let's do the music program. Let's get the brain primed and prepped to even start to feel like that input coming in is meaningful. All these rich frequencies that you're hearing, they're all meaningful. The brain has to then make a decision based on your experience, what is relevant to that particular moment. But some of these kids don't even know that there is an auditory system. They have shut it off so strongly that it's almost like they have a good hearing system, but they're almost deaf because they're not allowing the sensations to come through, or in their brain they have tuned it off completely. So for those kids that are nonverbal, or they don't have even a basic sense of what communication means, those are the kids that I'll always start with this very basic music perception, rhythm training program. Um, and sometimes I will recommend, the reflex integration, primitive reflex integration. There's a lot of different things that I'll recommend that comes as a foundation even before the concept of communication starts to develop.
You brought up an interesting point. That's also a large area of conversation. I have worked with children, and know many of our colleagues, Kavita, have worked with children that can exhibit as deaf, as completely non-hearing, that have perfectly functional hearing. And, often, something has happened in their development, in their life, often in the non-classical pathway, where they have shut down this sense as a form of self-protection because of perceived threat due to a trauma or something that's happened in their life. And it's amazing when we can access that child or that adult sometimes through the music perceptual training, as you're describing it with the listening program, and we meet them and provide a sense of safety in that auditory experience, and we watch this awakening, that I call it, and we begin to see an ease in the face and in their body, more comfort in the environment, some joy in their face. And then what follows is we begin to see some emergence of speech
Yep.
and that language. Do you have an experience with a client that's, maybe been at that extreme?
Yes, there is. I'm still seeing this young woman. She came to me in her late teens, and she's one still an enigma to me. I don't know what they don't have much on the birth history. We just don't know what had gone on during the whole process of birthing, but she's one that was able to hear speech sounds clearly, even when I presented it to her through headphones at 10 decibels, she heard those speech sounds. But when I did pure tone audiometry, just tones, I was blasting it at 100 decibels. She had no idea. She was not recognizing any of the environmental sound. The fire engine would go across the street and she would not even react to it. And she's one that I did the movement program that you have, the
Oh,
movement program with the music and the movement. And I've done everything, a lot of other things also along with the simple and effective. But she now, recently, we were sitting in my room and there was which she would not do. I've been seeing her for almost 4 years now. She wouldn't even respond to the knock on the door now. She'll be in my room and somebody knocks, she kind of will look that way, or there's a noise outside, she will, I see her reacting to some of that. So that's very, rewarding to see that she's
mm,
actually making some reaction to environmental sounds. Her mom said that they were out and about sometime and there was a bird chirping and she kind of looked around to look for that, something she wouldn't do.
mm,
So that's one case that still don't know what else is going on in the brain unless we do a full functional MRI. I'm not sure, but I'm sure with all of these therapies, there is something is happening there. Some connection is happening that's making meaningful motor output for her.
mm. What an example. And I think we realize, I think, how much we take for granted
Yeah.
our abilities
Yes,
and,
absolutely.
and the senses and what happens when pathways are, for lack of a better word, shut down and
Mm-hmm.
closed,
Mm-hmm.
for self-protection or whatever may be happening. Briefly, Kavita, I'm interested, just some day-to-day without the listening program, without other tools, just some practical ways to strengthen listening and communication in the home or in the school. Just what are some easy to implement strategies that you might recommend for those joining us today?
Uh, I think good, strong, and auditory stimulation in terms of any kind of classical music, play that in the background. I think you have some sound health, those kind of things. Those are great to help that little brain develop and listen and hear and make meaningful connections. Basically, trying to help the brain. This is what I feel like we should be always doing. Any kind of stimulation you do, you have available, it has to be meaningful. It
Mm,
has to make sense to the brain, coherence. Just having plain white noise without any meaning may not help the brain develop those pathways as much as having some meaning to it. Always make sure the child's, listening to you, giving you actual um, facial recognition that they've been spoken to and that you're expecting something back from them, helping them uh, be able to tolerate environmental sounds without feeling that it's a danger signal. So like one of the examples, again, going back to Jack Katz, he had taken his granddaughter for a baseball game, he said once, and she was so unhappy about that noise going around, and she wanted to go home. And what he basically told her, I'm rephrasing that, look around you, see everybody is having fun. Would you want to be part of that fun, or do you want to go home and just lose that opportunity? So when she was completely involved in herself and she felt emotionally dysregulated, she wanted to leave. But then when she kind of externally looked around and saw everyone cheering and having fun, she kind of changed her mindset to allow those external noise to come in, even if it was loud, and kind of emotionally regulated herself to the point that the brain actually started to learn how to filter out sounds that were too loud so she could tolerate it. So instead of putting on headphones to block off noises from outside, allow the child to be able to experience it, but also normalize that and say, look, we are all able to tolerate that. Let's see what we can do. We're having fun. Let's see how we can also be part of the fun. And, of course, you have to do some you have to make some judgment saying, okay, am I pushing that brain to the point of no return, or can they go to the point where they can strengthen themselves a little bit? So those are the things that you want to look for, opportunities to strengthen those pathways rather than use external devices to make the brain pathways weaker or faster maladaptive changes.
Beautiful example, and thank you. And much of what you've shared are much of the reason we created the Music for Babies collection, the Sound Health collection. So we can play this music ambiently in the environment to support different tempo, different rhythm, the full broad range of frequencies in a safe and accessible way that's imprinting, patterning onto the brain what we want it to be able to process and respond to. And it can work beautifully. This has been such a rich discussion, and we've had incredible questions coming in. So I want to take some time to explore these questions. So Kavita, if you're okay, we're going to dive in. And you mentioned white noise, and Joy Wyckoff asked, have white noise machines disrupted the development of auditory processing for infants and toddlers, as opposed to having music played in the background?
Yes, and that came from, I think, Nina Krause's research also. It's not meaningful to the brain, just having white noise on. You're better off having something meaningful, like, even I think even having a ocean sound or birds chirping sound, something that's meaningful to the in the environment that you would listen to, that would help the brain say this is a sound and this is what the meaning is, rather than just white noise which has no meaning, which then again makes those maladaptive imprints and neural pathways. And that's commercially, there are a lot of things commercially that are available that are not conducive to the brain's and body's development in nature's timeline. And I think it's making commercially, it's making money for them, so they're still selling it. But in the long run, I think it might not will, it might foster some hypersensitivity. It might foster some delays in the way they process auditory skills, and just not a very healthy. I would say an enriched environment is like vitamin to the brain. Give them an enriched environment, not just white noise, which doesn't have any meaning to it.
Yeah, I think it's the white noise is important, and you emphasized meaning. Sound needs to have meaning, and often white noise gets used in this broad term where technically the definition of white noise is every audible sound frequency at equal amplitude presented at once, and it's created by a signal generator. It is artificial in its nature, so it is not meaningful, and it's also been found to be a stressor in and unto itself. So, but then there's this balance of what we play, the frequency, the intensity, the duration of what's presented. So, I think often it could be difficult to know what to play. But if we think in general, beautiful, soothing nature sounds, birds, water, ocean, streams, brooks, classical music. Not all classical music is created equal. It needs, we don't want intensive Tchaikovsky pieces necessarily for our infant. We need to think about how we're presenting sound developmentally and that it's approachable for that child. We also have had just a question from Brett White, just directly to you, Kavita. Do you use a metronome in your sessions?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. I use the interactive metronome, and it's a great, again, another great adjunct program. I use that all the time. Yeah.
Beautiful. And I think you've addressed this, but Sabrina asked, and maybe we could just redefine, how do you establish a baseline for therapies like the listening program to kind of understand where are we so that we understand where we're going? Maybe you could just recap that approach.
I like the brain scale that you have on your website that gives
Yes.
a very good starting point. I just use I've taken a lot of those questions because I've given you credit for that. I've taken a lot of those questions from your TLP intake form and just compiled it, and I use that to send it to parents as in the initial intake form. And then I see how many of them on a scale from 1 to 3, if you have 10 questions on the emotional regulation and executive function on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being no problem at all, 1 being lots of difficulty. If they are reporting between 1 and 3, to me, that's significant. 4 and 5, I don't worry about it. 1 and 3, I feel like, so if they're reporting a lot of those um, in that range, I say, okay, there is a lot of dysregulation going on. We're not going to be able to get through meaningful auditory stimulation if we don't calm that system a little bit and help them be in that homeostasis in the neutral zone. One of the best examples I give for white noise, just going back to the other question, is the exhaust fan in your kitchen. If you have that on for a long time and turn it off, you can experience how stressful it is to your brain. You almost every time I turn it off, I go, it's that kind of, it just kind of takes over your brain so much that when you turn it off, you don't even realize it, but when you turn it off, you just kind of feel like a burden is lifted off of your shoulder. So that's, if you have that kind of noise going on in the background, especially through sleep, where sleep is such an important part of your growth and development, you're not helping that brain to be in that uh, sense of calmness, or that homeostasis is not there.
Yeah, I think, thank you. Often we don't realize that a sound is a stressor until it's removed from our environment.
Correct.
And just a couple of years ago, we needed to replace the wall ovens in our home and have beautiful new wall ovens that do all sorts of amazing things, but they have an overly efficient fan. And that overly efficient fan will run for 10 to 15 minutes as the oven's cooling down. And when it shuts off, all of a sudden my nervous system just,
Yeah.
you didn't realize you were on
Yeah.
this high alert, and
Exactly. Yeah.
it just
Absolutely.
shifts immediately. So unfortunately, we introduced a sound stressor into our environment, despite our awareness of everything. We wouldn't have bought it had we known. Um, so interested through one of the questions, what percentage of kids do you see in the research today or believe anecdotally that are in our schools may have a central auditory processing issue?
Um, I think this is again not based in hard science, but just from what are, and there are some people in from IGAPS. I belong to an association called International Guild of Auditory Processing Specialists, and if they want to chime in, I'll be happy to. I mean, it'll be great. But I think it's a 5% overall, but in the special ed population, it's about 20% is what they say. But again, a lot of us live with auditory processing and we don't even know it because we're doctors and physicians and PhDs, and you always equate your success to the, your degrees that you have amassed, and you don't realize how much uh, because you don't know any better, you don't realize how much inefficient, how you've reached that point with so much of inefficiency. So there are probably a lot of people out there who the Donna says general population 15 and special ed much more. So she's saying 15. So she probably she remembers it better than I do as Project Cats. So thanks, Donna. Anyways, what I'm saying is I think 15, as much as we know that they have reported it, but it might be a range of more than 15 because a lot of us don't even know we have auditory processing because we are
Yeah.
so quote unquote successful. And unless you have a life event that makes you have to go and get yourself tested, you probably live with that condition, that inefficiency um, for all your life. There is research completed. What did Donna said something there?
That came from Dr. Lucker,
Lucker, there's
25%
and
of school
elementary
children with
school.
APD
So
problems identified.
it's pretty much a little bit all over the place.
Yeah.
So I think we still don't know for sure because that's when the children cannot communicate, the first go-to is speech and language therapy, which is don't get me wrong, I'm a speech therapist also. I can't say enough about the benefits of speech and language therapy, but if we don't do auditory processing testing on every child with a communication disorder or every child who's having reading skills difficulty, we will never know the um, real the number in the general population.
Thank you. Dr. Kaul, do you have any final thought that you would like to leave our listeners today?
Yes. The final thought is auditory system in the brain is not an attachment to the brain. It is integral to the whole brain. So when you're looking at a child wondering why communication is weak or why the reading skills are weak, the two huge red flags, please look at the whole brain, which means auditory processing, speech processing, language processing. Look at the whole brain, and they may not have an auditory processing disorder, but unless you look in that system and make sure it's not weak, you'll always be treating or building a house without strong foundation.
Thank you. Beautifully said. Dr. Kaul, thank you for sharing your experience and the very clear compassion that you have and just your dedication to this work and contributions to our field. You've definitely given us a very powerful understanding of how listening and speech and language are woven together and how music can help bring them into balance. For everyone that joined us, we hope that you're leaving with a deeper sense of how communication grows from listening and how that growth can continue throughout our lifespan. If you'd like to connect further with Dr. Kaul, you can follow Hear, Express, Learn, Process on Facebook or visit her website at hearexpresslearnprocess.com. And again, Dr. Kaul practices in Richmond, Virginia. To learn more about or get started with the listening program, visit us at advancedbrain.com. Email us at info@advancedbrain.com. You can call country code 1-801-622-5676 and be sure to follow us on Instagram at Advanced Brain Technologies. And everyone, thank you again for joining us, and I hope you make it a terrific day.
Thank you very much. Have a great day.